Hi readers, welcome back to my channel. Lee here, and a lot of booktubers do Friday reads, and I've watched a couple of them and not sure that's something I want to do with my channel. I think what I'd like to do is author spotlights, and in this I will talk about authors whose work has made an impact on my life or who I just really love, and share with you some of the books that I've collected over the years by these authors. So, to start with, I've got two authors whose work is similar, and I hate to read either of these two main books because both of them broke my heart. And those two authors are Wilson Rawls and Robb White. Most of you know Wilson Rawls. He wrote Where the Red Fern Grows. This is how much I love that book. I have an extra copy of it that is not torn up, but again, I am afraid to reread this as I've gotten older. Harm to animals really bothers me, and this book made me sob almost every time I've read it, so I know I'm not sure I can do a reread on this. However, I love the book. Wilson Rawls was born Woodrow Wilson Rawls in 1913 in the Ozark Mountains, and this, Where the Red Fern Grows, is really kind of almost autobiographical, and because it's a little bit about his life. He was homeschooled, and his mother would order books and read them to the children, and aloud, and then make the children read them as well. But at first, Wilson did not like books. He didn't like girl stories. Then his mom brought in Call of the Wild by Jack London, and that fired up his imagination. But Wilson, really, his grammar and his spelling wasn't too great. However, that didn't deter him from writing stories. So he did that throughout his childhood and young adulthood and collected these stories. But right before he got married in 1958, he burned all his writing. And then later he went and told his wife, her name was Sophie, that he had burned them and how he really wanted to be a writer. She encouraged him to follow his dream. He would write, she would edit, and in 1961, the Saturday Evening Post published one of his stories in 3 parts called The Hounds of Youth. That later was published by Doubleday as Where the Red Fern Grows. And, gosh, this copy is so tore up. Anywho, it was made into a movie in 1973, and then he wrote one other book, which was also made into a movie. I have 2 copies of that as well. That was Summer of the Monkeys. I think I could reread Summer of the Monkeys, possibly, because it was not as heartbreaking in my opinion, although it still made me cry, but it was not as heartbreaking as Where the Red Fern Grows. So, if you haven't read any Wilson Rawls, I found his writing beautiful. I love the story of Old Dan and Little Ann, and Billy, their owner. It was a beautiful story. The book is far better than the movie, of course, but it's a worthy read, in my opinion. I'd love to hear what you think about it if you've read it, or Summer of the Monkeys. Next up is Robb White. You may or may not know about him. I didn't get too detailed into his personal life, but he has written a lot more than I'm aware of. He wrote screenplays, TV scripts, and he wrote 24 novels. Most of them had a maritime connection, a setting, and a World War II connection, so that's kind of funny because that's my thing now. I do have, of his novels, if you can find a first edition or sometimes any edition in relatively good condition for cheap, snatch it up, because I did a little deep dive And one of the books that is considered collectible, very good, is going for $559 now. Other books, he did kind of another autobiographical, I cannot say that word today. He did an autobiographical book about his life with, I think, his first wife in the Virgin Islands, and that book is going for over $1,000, and I did not buy it. I did not. I think there might be a Reader's Digest collection version, and I'll consider that one because it's not as expensive as a first edition of Robb White. So I do have a Robb White book, The Lion's Paw, which I have not read, and I am probably going to put this on my read this year stack because I have not read it, and it also goes for a decent penny. But the book that connects Robb White and Wilson Rawls is The Haunted Hound. And I've got a story to tell you about this. I read this book when I was a child, and I never could get the story out of my mind. This was long before Amazon or anything like that, and I couldn't find a copy. It was published in 1950, and I was a child in the 70s and 80s, and there was just no copies around. My mother and I would search used bookstores in every town we would go to looking for, we both had the objective to find this book. And we never found it, and never found it, and never found it. And finally, I know people like to hate on Amazon, and so do I, but when Amazon started out, it was about used books, and I finally found my copy of The Haunted Hound. And I bought it, and it cost over $100 at that time. This was in the early 90s. I may have also bought myself a second copy of this book too. This one is not in as good condition as the first one, but I loved this book. It has a very sad ending, but there are other themes. I saw some criticism about it, that it's simple and that there is stereotypes, and it's been a long time since I've read it, so I can't speak to it. Probably racism. I don't remember that, but it was published in 1950, a very different time. And I would say I'd let you know when I reread, but again, similar to Where the Red Fern Grows, this also has a very sad ending involving a dog, and spoiler alert, he dies at the end, and I cried. But I still love this book. The story also talks about grief because Jonathan, who is the main character, his mother had passed away, and so he and his father were each on their own trying to deal with that grief and not getting very far with it until Jonathan finds pot liquor. Anywho, I would say it has a happy ending, but it's a little bit bittersweet. The Haunted Hound was also published again in 1959, I believe, under the name A Dog for Jonathan. And I had to restrain myself from buying a copy of that because I really probably don't need it. That does not mean I won't buy it. It was not as expensive as The Haunted Hound. Anywho, so this is about two favorite authors from my youth. I've only read the one book by Robb White. I read the two books by Wilson Rawls, but both of these were books that stayed with me from the time that I read them and continue to stay with me now. I'd love to hear any favorites that you have or any thoughts if you've read any of these books. That's all for me. I'll see you next week for an author spotlight on Friday, hopefully, and possibly another one during the week. Happy reading!